Chapter 1. The Blood Moon. The village of Bakjiang lay in uneasy silence, nestled between thick forests and misty hills. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and burning incense. Tonight, the villagers gathered in tight circles outside their homes, eyes flickering toward the sky, where an enormous blood-red moon hung ominously. Its light bathed the land in a crimson glow, casting eerie shadows that twisted and stretched like grasping fingers. In the village square, an ancient temple stood, its wooden pillars worn from time and weather. Strange symbols, long faded, were carved into the stone steps leading up to the entrance. A group of elders sat cross-legged before it, murmuring prayers under their breath. Their faces were lined with fear, their voices trembling as they spoke of the curse, the horror that came whenever the blood moon returned. "The Kui cow awakens tonight," an old woman whispered, clutching a string of wooden prayer beads. Her frail hands trembled as she turned each bead, her eyes never leaving the moonlit forest beyond the village. Lam, a journalist from Hanoi, watched with skepticism. He had heard rumors of a haunted village, of a demon dog that hunted beneath the blood moon, a perfect story for his magazine. He had come expecting folklore and superstition, not the genuine terror he now saw in the villagers' faces. "It's just a natural phenomenon," Lam scoffed, "the moon turning red. It's caused by dust and light refraction, isn't it? Why be afraid of something so explainable?" A heavy silence fell over the villagers. A wiry old man with sunken eyes turned to him. His voice, though quiet, carried an unsettling certainty. "You do not understand, outsider." He gestured toward the forest, where shadows flickered among the trees. "The blood moon is no mere shadow. It is the beast's eye, watching us." Before Lam could respond, a gust of wind howled through the village, carrying the sharp scent of rotting meat. It snuffed out several lanterns, plunging the square into near darkness. The villagers gasped, clutching each other. Then it came. A long, guttural growl echoed from the depths of the forest. The sound wasn't just deep, it was unnatural, a mixture of animal and something otherworldly. It vibrated through the ground, making Lam's stomach twist. A dog, perhaps. A wolf. But there were no wolves in this part of Vietnam. He turned toward the villagers, expecting someone to laugh, to tell him it was just a normal animal. Instead, he saw pure dread on their faces. The old woman who had been whispering prayers suddenly reached for Lam's wrist. Her grip was surprisingly strong, her nails digging into his skin. Her eyes were wild with desperation. "Leave before it sees you, boy." Her breath was warm against his ear. "Once the beast marks you, there is no escape." Lam forced out a chuckle, though the unease in his chest refused to fade. Superstition. Just old stories. Still, he found himself glancing toward the tree line. The night was impossibly dark beyond the reach of the lanterns, but then he saw it. At the very edge of the forest, two red eyes burned like embers, locked onto him. The shape of a massive, hunched figure loomed just beyond the trees, its form shifting as if it were made of darkness itself. Lam's breath caught in his throat. The air grew colder. The beast was watching. Chapter 2. The Forsaken Shrine. The next morning, Lam set out to explore the village, determined to prove that the terrifying events of the previous night were nothing more than the result of paranoia and superstition. Yet, despite the daylight, an eerie silence hung over Bakjiang. The villagers avoided his gaze, whispering among themselves, as if afraid that even speaking to him would bring misfortune. Only one person dared to approach him, Bale, the old woman who had warned him the night before. Her wrinkled hands clutched at a wooden charm, fingers trembling as she pressed it into his palm. "Go to the old shrine in the forest, but do not go alone." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "If you hear it, do not run. If you see it, do not speak." Lam frowned, but pocketed the charm out of politeness. He had no intention of letting ghost stories stop him. Lam hesitated. He had traveled across Vietnam, exposing myths and unraveling local legends, but last night had left an unease deep in his chest. The growl he had heard, the burning red eyes at the forest's edge. His rational mind told him it was just a trick of light and exhaustion. Yet the way the villagers recoiled when he asked about the shrine made his stomach tighten. Still, he had come for a story, and he wasn't leaving without one. The forest path was overgrown, tangled with roots and creeping vines. Each step Lam took sent dried leaves crunching underfoot, the sound far too loud in the eerie stillness. The deeper he ventured, the heavier the air became. It smelled of damp earth and something metallic, something like blood. After nearly an hour of walking, he saw it. The shrine stood in the heart of a clearing, its wooden pillars rotting, its roof sagging under the weight of time. It must have been beautiful once, but now it was nothing more than a decayed skeleton, abandoned and forgotten. Lam approached cautiously, his fingers grazing the warped beams. The carvings along the entrance were scratched away, deep claw marks gouged into the wood. He knelt down, tracing them with his fingertips. They were fresh. A gust of wind sent dried leaves spiraling around his feet, and for a moment he swore he heard something, a whisper. But when he turned, there was only the forest, dense and watching. Steeling himself, he stepped inside. The air changed instantly. Inside the shrine, it was colder, too cold for a humid jungle morning. Dust and decay covered the wooden floorboards, and in the dim light, Lam could make out faded murals stretching across the walls. He raised his flashlight, sweeping it across the artwork. What he saw made his breath hitch. The murals depicted a monstrous, dog-like creature with glowing red eyes, its gaping maw filled with jagged teeth. In each painting, the beast was different, devouring a man, dragging a child into darkness, standing over a pile of bones. The villagers in the murals knelt before it, offering someone to it. Lam's fingers tightened around his camera. This was more than just folklore. Near the altar, something caught his eye, a bundle of ancient parchment wrapped in frayed silk. Carefully, he unrolled it. The ink had faded, but he could still read the first few lines. He was once a loyal companion, a protector, but he was betrayed, and in his agony, he became something else, something cursed. The words blurred as the air grew heavier, pressing against his chest. Then, a sound, a low, guttural growl. Lam froze. It came from right behind him. The hairs on his arms stood on end as he turned, his breath shallow. From the darkened doorway, two burning red eyes stared back at him, gleaming like embers in the abyss. Something large shifted in the shadows. Then a clawed foot stepped forward. Chapter 3. The Mark of the Beast. Lam's breath caught in his throat. His body refused to move as the creature took another step forward. form shrouded in darkness. The glowing red eyes never wavered, burning like embers against the pitch-black void beyond the shrine's doorway. Then it spoke, a deep, guttural voice, thick with an unearthly resonance, slithered through the air like a whisper and a growl combined. "You should not be here." Lam's fingers clenched around the wooden charm in his pocket. His instincts screamed at him to run, but something about the beast's voice kept him frozen in place. He forced himself to raise his flashlight, his heart hammering against his ribs. The light revealed a monstrous shape, half dog, half shadow, its body unnaturally elongated. Thick, matted fur covered its hunched back, but parts of it shifted and swirled like smoke, as if it wasn't entirely solid. Its legs were bent at grotesque angles, its claws digging deep into the shrine's wooden floor. Drool dripped from its gaping maw, where rows of jagged, human-like teeth gleamed in the dim light. Lam stumbled backward, his boots scraping against the floorboards. The creature let out a low, rumbling snarl, not of hunger, but of warning. "You are not one of them, and yet you bear their scent." Lam's mind raced. Was it talking about the villagers? What the hell was this thing? His journalist instincts kicked in, forcing down his fear. If this was real, if this thing truly existed, then he had to document it. Slowly, he reached for his camera. The moment his fingers touched it, the creature lunged. With a thunderous boom, the shrine shook violently, dust and debris raining down from the rafters. Lam barely managed to throw himself aside as a massive clawed hand slammed into the spot where he had been standing, splintering the wood beneath it. The creature's breath was hot and rancid, filling the room with the stench of rotting flesh and burnt fur. Lam scrambled to his feet, his pulse roaring in his ears. The beast was fast, too fast. If it had truly wanted to kill him, it would have. No, it was toying with him. Lam backed toward the shrine's entrance, never taking his eyes off the monster. The creature lowered its head, its deep growl vibrating through the air. "You have seen too much, outsider." The moment its voice echoed through the shrine, something burned against Lam's skin. He gasped, clutching his forearm. A searing heat spread across his flesh, as if invisible claws were carving into him. He rolled up his sleeve and froze. A symbol was appearing, burning itself into his skin like molten iron. A jagged, ancient mark, its curves and lines pulsating with an eerie, dark energy. Lam let out a strangled cry, his legs nearly giving out. The beast grinned. "Now you belong to me." The shrine collapsed into darkness, and then Lam was falling. Chapter 4. The Descent into Darkness. Lam's world spun violently. His body felt weightless, as if he had been swallowed by the very air around him. The shrine vanished. The wooden floor beneath his feet crumbled into nothingness, and he was suddenly plunged into an abyss. Wind howled past his ears, but there was no ground, no sky, only an endless black void stretching in every direction. The suffocating scent of blood and decay thickened, clinging to his lungs. And then he hit the ground. The impact knocked the breath from his chest. He coughed, his palms scraping against something wet and cold. As he pushed himself up, his hands sank into mud. No, not mud. The ground was slick, warm, and sticky. Lam's breath hitched. He lifted his hands and recoiled. They were covered in blood. A metallic stench filled his nostrils, so thick it made his stomach churn. He frantically wiped his hands on his shirt, but the blood didn't come off. himself to look around. The darkness had lifted slightly, replaced by an endless crimson mist swirling around him. Shadows twisted through the fog, taking unnatural shapes before melting away. The distant sound of dripping water echoed, but when Lam strained to listen, he realized it wasn't water. It was the sound of flesh tearing. A low growl vibrated through the air. Lam froze. The mist parted, and he saw them. Scattered across the ground were bodies, hundreds of them, twisted and contorted in unnatural ways. Some were fresh, their skin pale and drained of color. Others were little more than rotting husks, their limbs tangled together in a grotesque mass. Their faces were frozen in silent screams, their mouths open wide, their hollow eye sockets staring into nothingness. A wave of nausea hit Lum, but he forced himself to stand. He needed to get out. He turned, searching for any path, any exit, but the landscape shifted before his eyes. What was once a blood-stained clearing became an endless corridor of twisted trees, their gnarled branches reaching toward him like skeletal hands. The crimson mist pulsed as if it were alive, whispering his name. Then a familiar voice, Lam. His blood ran cold. He knew that voice. Slowly, he turned toward the sound. Standing just a few meters away was his father, or rather, something wearing his father's face. Lam's father had been dead for 5 years, yet here he was, his features exactly the same as Lam remembered, down to the slight wrinkle between his brows. But his eyes were hollow. Black pits stretched where his pupils should have been, and when he smiled, his teeth were too sharp, too many. You should not be here, Contri. The thing spoke in his father's voice, but it was wrong. The tone was just slightly off, like a recording played at the wrong speed. Lam took a step back. His pulse pounded in his ears. You're not real. His voice came out hoarse. The thing cocked its head. Neither is this place. Before Lam could react, the mist surged forward, wrapping around his body like icy tendrils. A force, unseen but crushing, pinned him to the ground. Pain erupted from his arm. Lam screamed, clutching his forearm. The burning mark the beast had given him in the shrine glowed red hot, the lines twisting and reshaping. It was no longer just a symbol. It was alive, pulsing like a beating heart. The thing wearing his father's face laughed. The mark is yours now, Lum. You carry the beast's curse. Lum gritted his teeth, his vision blurring from the pain. What do you want from me? The laughter stopped. Then, in a voice colder than death, it whispered, to make you one of us. A clawed hand erupted from the mist, reaching for his throat. Lam had no time to scream before everything turned black. Chapter 5. The Awakening. Lam's consciousness drifted in and out, caught between nightmares and reality. Distant echoes of snarls and growls reverberated through his mind, accompanied by the feeling of something pulling him downward, into the earth, into the darkness. The pain in his arm burned like liquid fire coursing through his veins. Then, suddenly, silence, a deep, suffocating quiet. Lam's eyes shot open. He gasped for breath, his lungs aching as if he had been drowning. His body felt heavy, every muscle stiff and unresponsive. Cold sweat soaked his shirt, but the dampness against his skin didn't feel like sweat at all. It felt thicker. With trembling hands, he sat up. Where was he? The forest was gone. The shrine was gone. The crimson mist, the endless pit of corpses, it had all vanished. Instead, he was lying on a wooden floor inside a dimly lit room. The walls were made of bamboo and old, rotting wood, barely holding together. Thin paper windows filtered in a weak, flickering light. The air smelled of incense and something acrid, something metallic. A faint sound reached his ears, dripping water. Lam turned his head and his stomach twisted into knots. A trail of blood led from where he lay to the far side of the room, pooling beneath a wooden altar. Thick, dark stains soaked the wood, as if something had been sacrificed there many times before. The air buzzed with a strange energy, as though the very walls were alive, watching him. His breathing quickened. Was this still a dream? The last thing he remembered was the creature's mark burning into his flesh, the ghostly figure wearing his father's face, the hand reaching from the mist to pull him under. And now, this place. His fingers dug into his arm where the mark had been seared into him. He hesitated before slowly rolling up his sleeve. His blood turned to ice. The mark had changed. The simple, jagged lines had spread, veins of black ink now crawling up his skin like cracks in shattered glass. It pulsated faintly, as if alive, as if something was inside him, moving. Lam's breath came in shallow gasps. This wasn't over. The curse hadn't ended. A sudden noise made him flinch. Footsteps, soft, deliberate, circling just outside the fragile walls of the hut. Lam stiffened. He reached for his camera. Gone. His bag, his phone, all gone. The only thing he had was the wooden charm Ba Lo had given him. It was still in his pocket, still warm against his fingers. The footsteps stopped. A slow, heavy breath rasped from just outside the door. Lam held his own breath, his pulse hammering in his ears. Then, knock, knock, knock. A pause, then a voice, soft, familiar. Lam, Kontrai, Mokwaji. Lam's blood froze. It was his father's voice. Again. No, it wasn't real. He gripped the wooden charm tighter. Kona, Saukong Mokwa. The voice was closer now, almost inside his head. Lam clenched his jaw, refusing to move. Then the voice changed, from soft, pleading, to something inhuman. Mokwara. Bang. Something slammed against the door, the entire hut shaking violently. Lam scrambled backward, pressing himself against the far wall. His heart felt like it would burst from his chest. The bamboo walls groaned, splinters raining down as clawed fingers tore through the gaps. A deep, guttural growl filled the room. You are already mine, Lam. The door splintered open, and two burning red eyes locked onto him. Chapter 6. The Blood Pact. Lam barely had time to react before the door exploded inward, sending shards of bamboo and wood flying across the room. He threw himself to the side just as a massive, clawed hand swiped through the space where his head had been moments before. The room plunged into chaos, the air thick with the scent of burnt fur, blood, and something ancient, something wrong. Red eyes gleamed from the darkness outside. The beast had returned. Lam scrambled backward, pressing himself against the farthest wall. His fingers trembled as they reached for the wooden charm in his pocket. It was still warm, too warm, almost burning. The creature stepped into the hut, its hulking form barely fitting through the doorway. It was even more monstrous up close. Its fur was matted with dried blood, its limbs too long, its spine unnaturally curved. But the worst part was its mouth. It was grinning, rows of jagged, human-like teeth stretched far beyond what should be possible, as if its face was splitting apart at the seams. Saliva dripped onto the wooden floor, sizzling as if it were acid. You cannot run, Lam. The voice was not just inside the room, it was inside his head. Lam clutched clutched his temples as a wave of dizziness crashed over him. His vision blurred, the walls of the hut melting away, replaced by a vast, endless expanse of blackened earth. The ground beneath him cracked, revealing pools of writhing shadows, like a living tar. He was no longer in the hut. He was somewhere else, somewhere older, somewhere cursed. Lam tried to move, but his body would not obey him. His feet sank into the darkened ground as if it were swallowing him whole. The beast watched him. "You bear my mark. You cannot escape it." Lam gasped as a burning pain ignited in his arm. He looked down. The black veins had spread further, curling up toward his neck, his chest. The curse was growing. "But there is another way," the beast continued, circling him. Its claws left deep gouges in the earth, where more black mist rose like smoke. "A pact." Lam's heartbeat thundered. "Surrender to me, and I will give you power beyond anything your kind could dream of." As the beast spoke, visions flooded Lam's mind. He saw himself standing atop a mountain of corpses, his hands dripping with blood, his body twisted into something no longer human. He saw himself hunting. He saw himself becoming one of them. His stomach churned, bile rising to his throat. No, he would not become this. But then, another vision. He saw his mother, her frail frame hunched over an altar, praying for his safety. He saw Bala, the old woman who had warned him, pleading with unseen spirits. And then, he saw them die. A horrific vision of their bodies torn apart, their screams drowned by the sound of snapping bones. Lam's breathing became ragged. "This is the price of your defiance," the beast whispered. "Resist, and I will take them, every last one of them." Lam's hands curled into fists. His body trembled, not just from fear, but from rage. This thing thought it could break him. Slowly, painfully, he forced himself to stand. The beast tilted its head as if amused. "So you fight?" Lam lifted his arm, the cursed mark glowing red-hot. The wooden charm in his pocket flared to life, its warmth spreading through his chest. "I am not yours." Lam's voice was hoarse but steady. The beast snarled. The ground beneath Lam cracked apart. The darkness howled. And then, everything erupted into fire. Chapter 7. The Flames of Defiance. A roar of fire erupted from the cursed mark on Lam's arm, swallowing the world in a blinding inferno. The beast let out a deafening howl of rage, its massive form recoiling as the flames surged toward it. The suffocating darkness that had surrounded Lam shattered, replaced by a searing heat that burned but did not harm him. The wooden charm in his pocket glowed brighter, its warmth spreading through his veins like liquid fire. For the first time, the beast hesitated. Lam felt it, the power surging within him. The pain that had once consumed him was now something else entirely. It was no longer just a curse, it was a weapon. The burning mark on his arm pulsed, and with it, the flames twisted around his body like a living entity, responding to his very thoughts. The beast let out a guttural growl, its red eyes narrowing. "You dare defy me?" Lam clenched his fists. For the first time, he was not afraid. "I am not yours," he spat. The beast's form shifted, its already monstrous body twisting into something even more grotesque. Its spine snapped and elongated, its fur peeling away in patches to reveal rotting, blackened flesh beneath. More mouths, jagged and filled with rows of needle-sharp teeth, ripped open across its body, each one hissing and snarling in unison. It lunged. Lam reacted purely on instinct. He threw his hand forward, and the flames answered. A pillar of fire exploded from his palm, colliding with the creature's chest. The force sent it crashing backward, its massive claws carving deep furrows into the ground as it struggled to remain standing. The beast let out an inhuman screech, the fire searing its flesh, burning away the mist that had once made it invincible. The very ground trembled beneath them, as if the spirit world itself was reacting to the battle. Lam's breathing was ragged, but he held firm. He could fight this thing. The beast bared its teeth, its many mouths howling in fury. "You think you can break free, foolish boy?" It vanished. Lam barely had time to react before something cold and sharp sliced across his side. He gasped, staggering as pain lanced through his ribs. The beast had moved faster than his eyes could follow. It reappeared behind him, its claws dripping with his blood. "You may burn, but you are still mortal," it sneered. Lam gritted his teeth, pressing a hand to his wound. His fingers came away soaked in crimson, but something was different. The blood that dripped from his wound sizzled against the ground. The mark on his arm flared violently, as if responding to the pain. The fire surged again, but this time it wasn't just flames. It was something deeper, something older. The air around him hummed, vibrating with an ancient power. The wooden charm in his pocket pulsed, and suddenly, Lum understood. This was not just a curse. It was a contract, and he could control it. The beast's eyes flickered with something almost like realization. "Impossible," it hissed. Lam took a deep breath. He had one chance. Channeling every ounce of willpower, he raised his arm and focused on the fire, not as something wild and uncontrollable, but as something that belonged to him. The flames answered. They rushed forward, spiraling into his hand, forming a blade of pure, searing light. The cursed mark on his arm bled into the weapon, forging something neither holy nor evil, but something entirely his own. The beast saw it, and for the first time, it stepped back. Lam's lips curled into a determined smile. "Now let's see who's really in control." And with that, he charged. Chapter 8. The hunter and the hunted Lam lunged forward, the blade of fire in his grasp glowing like a burning star. The cursed energy within him had fully awakened, and for the first time, he was not running. He was fighting. The beast's many mouths twisted into grotesque snarls as it dodged with inhuman speed, moving like a shadow shifting between worlds. Clawed hands lashed out, aiming for Lam's throat, but he was faster. He twisted his body, barely avoiding the strike, and brought the flaming blade up in a vicious arc. The weapon sliced through the creature's arm, blackened flesh searing as the beast let out a spine-chilling howl. The air shook. Lam stumbled back, gripping the blade tighter as the beast reeled in pain. Dark mist poured from the wound like thick smoke, writhing and twisting as though alive. But the wound was already closing. The beast's body regenerated almost instantly, its severed flesh knitting itself back together in seconds. It grinned, sharp teeth glistening with saliva. "You cannot kill what has no life." Then it vanished. Lam's instincts screamed at him, and he barely managed to duck as the beast reappeared behind him, claws aiming for his spine. He rolled forward, spun, and slashed upward, a wave of fire erupting from the blade. The beast hissed, recoiling as the flames licked its body. But this time, it did not retreat. It charged. Lam barely had time to react before a massive force slammed into his chest, sending him flying backward. His body crashed through the hut's weakened walls, landing hard against the ground outside. Pain exploded through his ribs. He gasped, his vision blurring for a moment. Above him, the sky was twisting. The stars were wrong. The world was shifting. He wasn't just fighting in the physical realm anymore. The beast was dragging him deeper. The land around him was warping, twisting into something ancient, something haunted. He was no longer in the ruins of the village shrine. He was somewhere far worse. Lam staggered to his feet, his grip tightening on the blade. His wounds burned, but he refused to fall. A low, menacing growl rumbled through the air. The beast was circling him, its massive form shifting in and out of the shadows, its glowing eyes never leaving him. "You fight well, boy," it hissed, its voice coming from all directions at once. "But you have no idea what you are up against." Lam wiped the blood from his lips. "Then show me." The beast let out a deep, guttural laugh. And then, the ground split apart. 100 twisted forms began crawling out from the darkness. Misshapen creatures, their bodies half human, half beast, their eyes burning with the same cursed red glow. Lam's breath caught in his throat. They were the lost souls, those who had made the pact before him, those who had failed. Their bodies were twisted beyond recognition, their flesh stitched together with shadows, their mouths filled with shrieks of agony. And now, they were coming for him. The beast watched, amused, as its minions began their descent. "Let's see how long you last, Lam." With a roar, the cursed creatures charged. Lam raised his blade, the flames flaring to life. He had come too far to die now, so he ran straight into the fire. Chapter 9. Into the Fire. Lam charged forward, his blade of fire illuminating the cursed battlefield around him. The lost souls, twisted, wretched remnants of those who had fallen to the pact before him, rushed in from all sides, their movements jerky and unnatural, their mouths open in eternal, soundless screams. The air was thick with the stench of burning flesh, but Lam had no time to process it. The first creature lunged, its clawed hand swiping at his chest. Lam twisted his body, barely avoiding the blow, and brought his blade down in a sharp arc. The fire tore through the creature, its body erupting into smoke and ash, as if it had never truly existed. But there were dozens more. Lam barely had a moment to breathe before the next one struck. A half-decayed woman with empty eye sockets lunged at him, her skeletal hands reaching for his throat. He drove his flaming blade through her chest, the fire consuming her in an instant. Another charged from behind, but Lam spun, his free hand catching a small rock from the ground. He infused it with fire, then hurled it like a bullet, the makeshift projectile piercing through the creature's skull. It collapsed into the dirt, twitching, before vanishing into the mist. For a moment, Lam thought he was gaining the upper hand, but then a horrific screech filled the air. The remaining creatures suddenly stopped, their twisted forms shuddering as they turned towards something even more monstrous. Lam's grip tightened on his weapon, his heartbeat pounded in his ears, and then he saw it. From the darkness, a new figure emerged. It was massive, far larger than the others. Its body was covered in patches of rotting fur, its limbs too long, too unnatural. Its head was that of a horrific, skeletal hound, its mouth lined with jagged, human-like teeth. Its eyes burned like embers. It was a true Gui cow, not just a cursed soul, but a fully transformed demon. It let out another ear-splitting howl, shaking the very air around them. The lost souls retreated, bowing their heads in submission. Lam stood his ground. "So this is what I'll become if I lose," he muttered. The beast grinned. "No, boy," it rasped. "This is what you already are." And then it charged. Lam barely had time to react before the demon's claws crashed against his blade, sending shockwaves rippling through his entire body. The force sent him scudding backward, his boots digging trenches in the dirt. The beast was faster than anything he had faced before. It vanished, then reappeared behind him. Lam turned just in time to block the next strike, but the impact knocked the air from his lungs. Pain exploded through his side. The beast's claws raked across his ribs, cutting deep. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself to stay upright. His vision blurred for a second, but he couldn't afford to be weak now. "You are already mine," the beast whispered, circling him. "You feel it, don't you? The curse inside you. It is growing. It is spreading." Lam's arm throbbed violently, the cursed mark searing into his skin. For the first time, doubt flickered in his mind. What if it was right? What if he was already too far gone? What if no matter how much he fought, he would still become the very thing he despised? The beast lunged again, this time faster than before. Lam raised his blade, but the demon was too close. There was no time. The claws slammed into his chest. For a brief, terrifying moment, everything went dark. Chapter 10. The Breaking Point. The world was swallowed in blackness. Lam could hear nothing but his own ragged breathing. His chest burned, the deep gashes left by the beast's claws pulsing with unbearable pain. Blood soaked his tunic, warm and sticky against his skin. His fingers twitched, reaching for his blade, but it was gone, lost in the darkness. A sickening voice slithered through the void. "You cannot fight what you have already become." Lam's heartbeat pounded against his skull. No, he wasn't like them. He wasn't like this monster. Was he? The cursed mark on his arm throbbed violently, the pain now a searing heat crawling up his veins, coiling around his heart. And then he saw himself, a reflection standing in the void. But it wasn't just his reflection. Its eyes burned red. Its flesh was peeling, patches of blackened fur spreading across its body. And when it smiled, its teeth were no longer human. Lam staggered back, his breath catching in his throat. "No," he whispered. The reflection tilted its head. "You can feel it, can't you?" it murmured. "The hunger, the rage, the power." Lam clenched his fists, shaking. "I'm not like you." The reflection laughed, a deep, guttural sound that made his stomach twist. "You've already changed." Lam's chest tightened. He looked down. His hands. They were no longer human. Long claws had begun to sprout from his fingertips, his skin darkening, cracking as if something beneath it was trying to break free. "No," he gasped, gripping his arm, his nails digging into his own flesh. "I won't let it win." The reflection only smiled wider. "But you already have." Then the darkness shattered. Lam's eyes snapped open. The real world came rushing back in a violent wave. He was on the ground, his body trembling, his vision blurred from the pain. The taste of iron filled his mouth, his own blood, and standing above him, the Gui cow. It watched him with amusement, its massive form looming like a nightmare made flesh. "You hesitated," it said. "Now you are mine." Lam's breath came in ragged gasps. His fingers searching, desperate. Then they closed around something warm. His blade. The fire had dimmed, but it was still burning. The beast saw it and laughed. "Foolish boy, you cannot kill me." Lam forced himself to his knees, his entire body screaming in protest. His cursed arm burned hotter than ever, the pain almost unbearable. He gritted his teeth. Then, in one last desperate act, he drove the blade deep into his own arm. The pain was instant, blinding, searing. But the effect was immediate. The fire roared to life, erupting from his wound, twisting and spiraling around his body. The beast's grin vanished. For the first time, it looked afraid. "What have you done?" it hissed. Lam rose to his feet. His entire body burned with fire and agony, but he was still standing, still human. He clenched his flaming fist. "I choose my own fate." Then, with a roar, he charged. Chapter 11. The Last Stand. The night howled with fire and fury. Lam charged, his blade burning brighter than ever, the flames twisting around his body like a second skin. The Kwai cow roared, lunging forward with inhuman speed, its claws outstretched. They collided. The impact shook the earth, sending shockwaves rippling through the air. Sparks exploded where Lam's flaming sword met the beast's claws, the cursed energy crackling violently. Lam gritted his teeth, forcing his strength into the blade. The flames flared, searing into the beast's flesh. The Kui cow howled in agony, its skin blackening, cracking, peeling away under the holy fire. But it did not fall. Instead, it struck out wildly, its claws raking across Lam's already wounded chest. Pain exploded through his body. His vision blurred, his legs buckled. But he did not fall. "Weak," the beast sneered, though its voice wavered with pain. Lam spat blood. "You're afraid." The beast's glowing eyes narrowed. Then it lunged again. But this time, Lam was ready. He sidestepped, twisting his body just enough to let the attack graze past him. Then, with all his strength, he drove his flaming blade straight into the beast's chest. The sword sank deep, piercing through muscle and bone, the fire erupting within the monster's body. The Kui cow let out a deafening shriek, its voice raw with agony. The fire spread like a living thing, consuming its flesh, its bones, its very essence. It staggered back, clawing at its burning chest, its monstrous form beginning to wither. For the first time, it looked mortal. It looked defeated. But then, it laughed, a low, rasping, chilling sound. "You think this ends with me?" it whispered, even as its body crumbled into ash. Lam froze. The air around him shifted. The ground cracked. And then, a new voice echoed from the darkness. A voice that did not belong to the Kui cow. A voice that was far worse. "The true curse has only begun." The last remnants of the beast vanished into the night, and Lam was left standing alone, his blade still burning, his breath ragged, his body broken. But now, something else was watching him. Something older, something waiting. The final battle was not over. It had only just begun. Chapter 12. The Eternal Curse. The night stood still. The ground beneath Lam's feet was no longer earth. It was something else, shifting, pulsing, alive. The shadows around him twisted and swirled, whispering in a language that scraped against his mind like broken glass. The Kwai cow was dead, but something worse had awakened. Lam tightened his grip on his blade, though his body screamed in protest. His wounds were deep, his strength waning, but the fire still burned. And then, the sky split open. A massive, rotting hand burst from the darkness, its fingers long and jagged, each claw dripping with blackened ichor. The ground cracked beneath its weight, and from the abyss, a form began to rise, something far beyond the horror of the Quikao. Lam staggered back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. This was the source, the true curse, not just a single demon, but the origin of them all. A voice echoed in the void, deep and ancient, filled with both rage and amusement. "You think you have won, mortal." Lam braced himself, but the voice laughed, a sound so terrible it sent ice down his spine. "You killed one hound, and yet you stand at the gate of something far greater. You are still marked. You are still cursed. You cannot escape." The cursed mark on Lam's arm ignited in pain, burning hotter than ever. He fell to one knee, gripping it, gasping. The fire he had summoned now turned against him, curling around his skin, threatening to consume him. And for the first time, he understood. The curse was never just the beast. The curse was him. It had always been a cycle. The Quikao before him had once been a man, just like him, a warrior who had fought the curse, only to become it. And now it was his turn. Lam's hands trembled. "No," he whispered. The massive entity reached for him, its enormous claws stretching through the void. "You will take its place. You will become the next. It is the law of blood, the price of fire, the fate of all who bear the mark." The shadows pressed in, and for a moment, Lam saw himself again, not as a warrior, not as a survivor, but as a beast. Fangs bared, fur matted with blood, red eyes burning with hunger. His own future, his own fate. Unless Lam's eyes snapped open, the fire inside him was not just a weapon, it was a choice. With one last breath, he turned the blade on himself. The fire roared to life, engulfing him entirely. It seared through flesh, bone, and soul. The mark on his arm cracked, then shattered. The monstrous hand in the abyss reeled back, its form flickering, the darkness screeching in protest. "No, this is not how it ends." But it was too late. Lam's fire burned through the curse itself, consuming it from within. The shadows screamed, the cursed realm collapsed, and then silence. Lam's eyes fluttered open. The sky above was clear, the night air cool against his skin. The forest had returned to normal, silent, still, untouched. His wounds were gone. His body felt light, and the mark on his arm vanished. He had done it. He had broken the cycle. But as he stood, looking around at the eerie quiet of the land, he couldn't shake the feeling that something still watched him. That the curse, though broken, had not forgotten. That somewhere, deep in the shadows, it was waiting. Waiting for the next warrior to make a choice. Waiting for the next soul to fall. And as Lam walked away, disappearing into the trees, the wind carried a whisper. The fire always returns.